In the spring of 1834, in the heart of the quiet hills of Virginia, where tobacco fields breathed under the gentle sunlight, a truth lay hidden that no one would have believed without seeing it with their own eyes. A truth that proved evil does not always arrive with screams and violence, but sometimes enters softly, wrapped in smiles, prayers, and the appearance of a respectable family. A family named Sullivan living on the edge of the small community of Millbrook, a place where everyone knew one another, trusted one another, and believed that the worst things that could happen always came from outside, never from the neighbor's home. The Sullivan house was a two-story wooden structure with a simple porch and a red barn behind the yard. From the road, nothing about it seemed strange, and that very ordinariness was its greatest disguise. Constance Sullivan was known to all for her faint smile and calm voice. She said she had taken in several orphaned children from distant relatives and was caring for them until proper families could be found. And in an era when orphanhood was common, people believed her. The large purchases of flour, salt, and medicine were explained by the same story, and no one asked why the children were never seen at school or church. Some nights the lights in the house stayed on late, and the sound of hammering echoed from beneath the floor. But Ezra said it was for the children's comfort, and that answer was enough to silence curiosity if you too were moved by this story and want to hear more like it. Like the video now, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. From this point on, the story changes, because beneath this quiet house there was a basement that had been slowly expanded over many years, not like a storage cellar, but like a stone labyrinth designed to swallow sound. Iron rings were set into the walls, and chains allowed a child to move only a few steps before being pulled back. The children were between 6 and 16 years old, thin and sick, bearing wounds from neglect and punishment, and most terrifying of all was the order of their captivity, as if someone had spent years perfecting a prison. Upstairs, Constance played the role of a caring mother, but underground, mother was a title of control. The children learned to stay quiet, speak little, avoid eye contact, and cling to silence to survive. They were told they had no families, that no one was looking for them, and that outside this house only hunger and death awaited. That lie made the mental chains stronger than iron, and Millbrook, with all its trust, swallowed the lie for years, because seeing a well-regarded woman and hearing a few religious words was enough to kill suspicion. Until the winter of 1834 arrived, the cold widening cracks and making sounds clearer. A merchant caught in a snowstorm stayed the night and heard a muffled sound like crying beneath his feet. Weeks later, a migrant girl disappeared on her way to work. Then a local hunter heard screams that did not sound like play. He reported it, and whispers spread, until the sheriff decided to visit the farm himself. A house that had long symbolized peace, but was about to become a symbol of one of the darkest secrets in American history. A secret that could no longer remain hidden, because the screams had found their way out, and the truth was ready to reveal itself, even if no one wanted to see it. This story was meant to be told not to frighten, but to remind us that evil can hide behind the simplest faces, and that indifference is its greatest ally. Millbrook learned this lesson too late, and when it did, nothing was ever the same again. Because when truth is set free, it shatters homes, shakes minds, and rewrites history. This was only the beginning, because what was discovered in that basement was larger than a house, larger than a family, and larger than a town. This story would expose a system that silently devoured human beings for years, a system whose traces remain in history even today. And now we are reading it again, not for pleasure, but for understanding, to see clearly, and to make sure we never again accept such horrors as normal. This file had been sealed, but its voices were never silenced, because truth always finds its way sooner or later, even if buried underground for years. And this story is the first step in opening that sealed door, a door that once opened can never be closed, because history remembers, victims are not forgotten, and stories are eventually told, even when they are painful, even when they are dark, even when no one wanted to hear them for years. This is our beginning, not the end, because what comes next will be heavier, darker, and more real, and truth always carries weight, even when we try to ignore it. This case is now open, and there is no turning back, because the story of the Sullivans must be told fully, mercilessly, and honestly, even if it is hard to hear, even if it hurts to believe. This is the beginning of the truth, a truth hidden for years, and now. The next morning, Sheriff Benjamin Crawford arrived at the Sullivan farm with his deputy, Marcus Webb. The sun had just risen over the hills, and everything appeared calm on the surface. Constance opened the door with a smile, her manner polite and her voice steady. She expressed surprise at the rumors and said people had misunderstood the situation. Crawford tried to keep the atmosphere normal, asked a few routine questions, and referred to letters Constance claimed she had received from distant relatives. Everything seemed almost acceptable until the deputy asked permission to go to the backyard, where he saw something that made his heart drop. The basement entrance was secured with several heavy locks, and the wood around it bore deep scratch marks. Webb quietly returned inside and told the sheriff what he had seen. In that moment, Constance's behavior changed. Her hands began to tremble, and she said the basement was dangerous. But before the discussion could continue, a muffled sound rose from beneath their feet, the sound of crying. Crawford ordered the door to be opened. When the locks were broken, a heavy stench rose, a mixture of dampness, human waste, and despair. The stairs opened into a space larger than expected. Stone walls and iron rings were visible. Children, chained in place, stared silently. No crying, no screams, only eyes emptied of hope. Webb had to step outside several times to vomit. Crawford knew he was facing something far beyond an ordinary crime. In adjacent rooms, they found instruments of punishment, notebooks, and records of names, ledgers that proved this nightmare had continued for years, names with some crossed out. In another room, remains were discovered, children who had never left the basement. News spread through Millbrook. It was hard to believe, but the evidence was undeniable. Interrogations began. Constance remained silent, and Ezra attempted to deny everything, but the documents told a different story. The records revealed a network far beyond this house. Children bought, sold, and transferred. Local law was insufficient, and higher authorities became involved. As the rescued children were moved to safe locations, fear settled on the faces of Millbrook's residents. One question echoed in every mind: how could we not have seen this for so many years? The answer was bitter: trust, silence, and habit. This episode marked the end of an illusion, the illusion of safety, the illusion of family, and the illusion that evil always wears a violent face. Yet what was uncovered was only the beginning, because the trail of this crime led to places no one dared imagine, and the Sullivan case slowly turned into a national investigation, a case that would expose the true nature of power, corruption, and cruelty, even if the cost was immense. Because a door had been opened in the Sullivan basement that could never be closed again, and the story was slipping beyond anyone's control. A story destined to grow far darker, because this was not just a house, but part of a system still breathing in the shadows, with no one knowing where it truly ended. This episode does not end here. It is a gateway to a larger truth, a truth that would shake everything. And what comes next will be not only shocking, but revealing. Because this case is no longer personal, it is a historical wound, and wounds, when reopened, cause pain, but do not remain hidden. This is exactly what is about to happen. Sooner or later, the truth rises, even if buried for years. And the story of the Sullivans is far from over, because this is only the beginning of the investigation, not its conclusion. And this is the point where everything becomes more serious, heavier, and more dangerous, because truth is the enemy of power, and power does not remain silent. Millbrook would soon learn this, and perhaps the entire country as well, as long as this case remained open and we moved forward step by step without turning back, because there is no path backward, only forward, and what comes in the next episode will prove that this case is larger, darker, and more dangerous than anyone had imagined, and no one will be spared from its consequences, even those who believe they hold power, because truth knows no boundaries, and once released, it changes everything in its path. After the discovery of the basement, the investigation entered a stage for which no one in Millbrook was prepared. Sheriff Crawford knew this case would no longer remain a local crime. The notebooks found in the adjacent room contained names, dates, and notes that revealed a clear pattern. Children were brought in regularly, kept for a period of time, and then either transferred or their names were crossed out forever. Some names had numbers written beside them, numbers that were later identified as the amounts paid for each child. This discovery changed the direction of the investigation because it showed that the Sullivans were not acting alone. More letters were found, written in different handwriting and bearing addresses from other states. Coded words were used in these letters, but their meaning was unmistakable. Human beings treated as merchandise. Crawford reported the findings to higher authorities, and for the first time, federal agents became involved in the case. At the same time, the rescued children slowly began to speak. Not all of them, not easily, but some shared accounts that shook even the most experienced investigators. They spoke of other places, of farms, houses, and locations that had never been in Millbrook. One girl said that before being brought here, she had been kept in another house, a house with wealthy individuals and unknown guests. These testimonies caused the case to expand dramatically, as it became clear that the Sullivans were part of a larger network, a network that had operated silently for years. Agents began tracing the letters, and names emerged that were well known in society: merchants, landowners, and even individuals with political influence. This was when the pressure began. Anonymous threats were sent to the sheriff. Some witnesses grew afraid, and others suddenly disappeared. But the case could no longer be stopped because the volume of evidence was too great to deny. Life in Millbrook changed. People looked at one another with fear. Silence replaced trust, and the same question lingered everywhere: what else might still be hidden? The Sullivan case was no longer only about the past, it was about the present and the future, because it revealed how evil can grow in the shadow of the law when power and money go unanswered. Investigators knew a difficult road lay ahead because they were no longer facing only criminals, but a system that had survived for years through secrecy. This episode marked the point at which the story entered a more dangerous phase, because every step forward exposed more powerful enemies, and no one knew how far the truth could go. But one thing was clear: this case would not be buried again, because the voices of the victims had finally been heard, and once a voice is heard, it cannot be silenced. Episode 3 does not end here. Rather, it is the point where the story begins to expand, an expansion that will expose more names, uncover older secrets, and reveal faces that had long been hidden behind respectability and power. And what comes in the next episode will show why this case should never have been ignored from the beginning, because once truth begins to move, it does not stop easily. And this is exactly what is happening now. The Sullivan case is fully opening, and its consequences will affect not only Millbrook, but far beyond it, and no one will be able to claim ignorance, because everything is now on the table, and the story has reached a point of no return. This is episode 3, not an ending, but the opening of doors that have been closed for years, and what follows will challenge not only history, but conscience itself. Because this case is about humanity, and when humanity is questioned, no one remains neutral. This path continues, and what you will hear in episode 4 will show how a local secret became a national catastrophe, and why nothing will ever be the same again. Because the truth has risen, and once the truth rises, it cannot be forced back underground. This is the beginning of a journey whose ending is unknown, but one thing is certain: this story is going to change everything, even if it is resisted, even if it is denied, because truth does not stop. As the case expanded, federal agents took control of the investigation. Millbrook was no longer a quiet town, but had become a sensitive point on the map of hidden crimes. The agents moved cautiously, knowing that any mistake could lead to the destruction of evidence or the escape of key figures. Interrogations began with those whose names appeared in the notebooks. Some cooperated, some chose silence, and others suddenly left town. Every small movement pointed to a larger network, a network that had remained hidden for years behind law, money, and connections. In Washington, reports were reviewed. Some officials worried about the political consequences of the case because the names led to influential families. Pressure to close the case began, but the volume of evidence was so overwhelming that ignoring it was no longer possible.
At the same time, some of the rescued children were transferred to other cities. Doctors and psychologists realized that the damage done to them went beyond chains and physical confinement. Many of them still blamed themselves, a lesson planted in their minds by years of control and lies. Medical reports were added to the file, deepening the scale of the tragedy. In Millbrook, other old houses were also investigated. Long-dismissed rumors came back to life. Stories once labeled exaggerations now began to make sense. Agents uncovered traces showing that the network was not limited to Virginia. Roots extended to southern states and even to the north. The case moved beyond the control of a single department. Multiple agencies were now involved, but coordination was slow and difficult because of conflicting interests. Some wanted the truth exposed, while others wanted reputations protected. In the midst of this, Sheriff Crawford came under intense pressure. The threats grew more serious, yet he knew that retreat would mean betraying the victims. He chose to cooperate, even if it cost him his job. This decision pushed the case into a point of no return because the documents had reached a level where they could no longer be hidden. The media slowly began to sense the story, and questions multiplied. Why had no one spoken for all these years, and what else might still be concealed? Episode 4 finds its true meaning at this moment, because the story is no longer only about a crime. It is about the structures that allowed that crime to continue for years, and what follows will show how power can delay the truth, but never bury it forever. The case has now gone beyond a single town, and what we will see in the next episode will reveal why exposing the truth always carries a heavy cost, but silence carries an even heavier one. This path can no longer be stopped because everything is now in motion, and episode 4 is not a stop, but a crossing of a border from which there is no return. The truth slowly rises to the surface, even if some refuse to see it, because once truth begins to move, it cannot be stopped. This is episode 4, not an ending, but a point of no return, because the truth is now flowing, and once it flows, its course cannot be altered. It instead sets the stage for what is to come, because the truth has begun to move, and nothing can stop it. This path is painful, but necessary, and what comes next will prove why silence was never the right option, because the truth has risen, and once it rises, it cannot remain hidden, even if someone refuses to accept it. And the story continues, ruthless, honest, real.
As the scope of the case became public, the atmosphere of the country gradually began to change. Newspapers started writing with caution, but not everything, only what was permitted to be published. Names were censored, details were removed, and reality reached the public in a controlled form. Yet even this incomplete information was enough to create fear. Families began asking questions, memories of missing children resurfaced, and letters that had gone unanswered for years were pulled from drawers once again. Some parents could not believe that traces of their children might be connected to this case, but the similarities were disturbing. The timing, the locations, the recurring patterns. At the same time, federal agents approached individuals whose names had never appeared in the media. People who sat not in basements, but in clean offices and large homes. Interrogations were carried out quietly, because a single mistake could unravel everything. In some instances, investigators hit a wall. Documents suddenly vanished, witnesses changed their statements, or lawyers stepped in, and everything stalled. It was here that the true meaning of power revealed itself, a power that worked not through force, but through delay, erosion, and exhaustion. Meanwhile, the rescued children in treatment centers slowly began to face reality. Some screamed at night, some withdrew into silence, and some, for the first time, began to describe details that had never appeared in reports. Names of places were mentioned that existed on maps but had never been investigated. Analysts realized they were dealing with a pattern that had repeated for years: movement, silence, and forgetting. And that very forgetting had been the safest refuge for crime. In internal meetings, it was said that the case had grown too large and needed to be managed, but management here meant controlling the truth. Still, something was changing, because once stories begin to overlap, everything can no longer be contained.
Names repeated themselves, locations aligned, and links that had remained hidden for years slowly connected. At this stage, the issue was no longer simply proving a crime. It was about who had allowed it to continue for so many years, and why no one had asked questions. The case had now reached a point with no return and no pause, because when truth begins to move, it finds its own path, even when obstacles are placed before it, even when it is denied. The movement was now underway, and every step forward shortened the shadows, revealing faces that had remained safe in darkness for years. And this was precisely the moment when the story became not only about the past, but about the present and what lies ahead. Because when truth begins to rise, it no longer accepts partial resolutions. And the case now stood at that exact point, where silence no longer worked and forgetting was no longer an answer. Because what had been buried for years had surfaced, and once that happens, there is no path back. The story was in motion, relentless, heavy, and uncontrollable, and what follows is driven not by individual will, but by the logic of truth itself. Because once truth begins to move, nothing can stop it, even if some refuse to see it or accept it. The path continues, and with every step, another curtain is pulled aside until there is nothing left to hide, because truth naturally moves toward the light, even if it takes years. And this is exactly where the story now stands, on the threshold of revelation, on the threshold of confrontation, and on the threshold of something that can no longer be ignored. Because when truth rises, it does not descend again, and the story now moves along this path, ruthless, persistent, and unstoppable, until no one can claim they did not know or did not hear, because the truth is now in motion, and once in motion, it carries everything with it, even if resisted, even if denied. The path continues, curtains fall one by one, because what was hidden for years has now decided to be seen, even if it comes at a cost, even if it is painful, real, undeniable.
As the investigation continued to advance, the case entered a phase that no longer relied solely on documents and testimonies, but had moved toward reconstructing roots and decisions. Investigators began piecing together timelines, movements, and old reports, and a quiet yet terrifying pattern emerged. Every time too many questions were asked, a child was relocated or a case was officially closed. This coincidence no longer seemed accidental. In several cities, reports of missing children had increased, yet full follow-ups were never completed. The reasons were always similar: lack of evidence, absence of witnesses, or cases closed for the sake of expediency. Investigators could now see how these so-called expediencies had formed a chain of silence. As roots were reconstructed, it became clear that children often disappeared in places with weak oversight, temporary stations, remote farms, or houses that appeared trustworthy. That appearance of safety discouraged questions. At the same time, some long-time employees began recalling things that had been ignored years earlier: letters that were filed late, reports that never received responses, and calls that led nowhere. These recollections revealed how the system itself learned what to forget. In some cases, even when a lead was accurate, the direction of the investigation was altered and the case steered toward a path that seemed less risky. Investigators now understood that these deviations were not accidental, but the result of deliberate decisions made at specific times. This realization made the case heavier because it showed that the crime had not survived only at the lowest levels, but had been sustained by indifference and decisions made higher up. At this stage, no one was looking for simple answers anymore. The central question had become, what drives a system to choose such paths? Fear, convenience, or shared interests? The case had become not only a crime, but a mirror reflecting the behavior of institutions. A mirror that revealed things difficult to face, yet impossible to deny. Investigators knew that every next step would bring not only new facts, but new resistance. Yet the movement did not stop, because the path had become clearer. The connections were nearly complete, and the map was gradually becoming readable. That clarity was dangerous, because the clearer it became, the more people saw themselves within it, and not everyone was ready to be seen.
It was at this point that the case moved beyond a purely investigative phase and entered one where every action carried consequences, not only for perpetrators, but for all those who had remained silent for years. This weight could be felt in the air, even when no one spoke, because the truth was no longer about the past, but about choices being made in the present, and those choices would determine how the story continued. Because when a system is forced to look at itself in the mirror, it can no longer pretend it has seen nothing. And this was the point at which the case now stood, on the threshold of confronting itself, on the edge of decisions from which there was no escape. Because once truth is seen, it does not let go. And the case was now moving along this path, steady, persistent, and irreversible, until nothing could return to the way it once was. Because what had been ignored for years had now moved to the center of attention, and that change could not be undone. The path continued not with noise, but with the weight of truth, and each next step placed more questions on the table, questions that were no longer simple to answer, but unavoidable. Because when truth is in motion, indifference is no longer an option. And this was exactly where the case now stood, midway along the road, surrounded by questions, facing a truth that could no longer be ignored. Because when something becomes this clear, one must either confront it or pay the price of escape. And the case had now brought everyone to that point, a point where the choice was no longer easy, but necessary. Because truth does not wait, and when its time comes, it reveals itself, even if no one is ready. And this path had now begun to shape consequences, consequences that could no longer be denied, real, inescapable. As the consequences of the case surfaced, the working atmosphere within the involved institutions changed dramatically. More meetings were held, yet fewer people spoke plainly. Everyone knew that every sentence could be recorded somewhere or used against someone. This caution weighed heavily on the environment. In some instances, old cases that had been closed for years were reopened, not because of new evidence, but because of a new reading of the same old documents. This reading revealed how certain details had been deliberately ignored, or how reports had been structured to produce specific outcomes. Investigators were now facing new questions about who had made decisions at critical moments and why those decisions had consistently led toward silence. Meanwhile, some mid-level employees no longer felt secure, not because they were criminals, but because they feared their names would be associated with decisions that were now under scrutiny. Some began limited cooperation, offering information that had been kept for years, but still with caution, because the line between exposing the truth and becoming a victim was dangerously thin. In certain documents, names appeared that had once seemed insignificant, but whose positions now shifted as it became clear what roles they had played in steering investigations. These discoveries showed how power can hide in small actions, in signatures, in delays, and in the transfer of files from one desk to another. At this stage, the case was no longer only about uncovering the truth, it was also about responsibility, about who should answer for what they had done or failed to do. This question echoed quietly yet persistently in meetings, without any simple answer. In the public sphere, a subtle change was also taking shape. Trust in institutions was no longer assumed, and people began asking questions that had gone unasked for years. This questioning unsettled some, because they knew that if it continued, it would not remain confined to a single case, but would challenge larger structures. Meanwhile, the investigation progressed slowly but steadily, not through sudden revelations, but through the accumulation of facts. And that accumulation was the most dangerous part of all, because it could no longer be dismissed as error or coincidence. A pattern had formed, and patterns are difficult to deny. At this point, everyone understood that returning to the past was no longer possible, not for the system, not for individuals, and not for those who had been ignored for years. This phase was not marked by noise, but it had impact, an impact that moved quietly yet deeply, because when truth assembles itself piece by piece, it can no longer be ignored. At the end of this phase, no one declared victory, because there was no victory to claim.
What existed was confrontation. Confrontation with decisions, with silences, and with consequences that could no longer be escaped. And this confrontation was now underway, relentless, quiet, and unforgiving, until no one could claim they did not know, because the truth now stood before everyone. And when that happens, the story no longer belongs to a single group. It involves everyone. The path continued not with promises, but with the weight of reality. And what lay ahead was not an ending, but the continuation of that same confrontation. Facing what had remained hidden for years and could no longer stay hidden, because once truth is seen, it cannot be returned. And this is precisely the point at which the case now moved, silent yet unstoppable, until everything became clear, even if it came at a cost, even if it was painful, because truth ultimately finds its own path, and that path had now begun, real, heavy, and inescapable. And no one could claim ignorance, because everything lay in plain sight. And this confrontation could no longer be postponed, even if some refused to accept it or tried to rename it, because truth is known by its own name. And the story now stood at this point, in the heart of confrontation, midway along the road, facing something that could no longer be ignored, because when everything becomes this clear, silence is no longer an answer.
As the case continued to move forward, the pressure took on a more serious form, not only from the outside, but from within the system itself. Some of those involved began to feel the ground shifting beneath their feet as the direction of the investigation moved toward a point where names could no longer be ignored. Certain meetings were canceled, some decisions were postponed, and a number of cases were quietly pushed off course. But this time delay was no longer effective because the traces had not been scattered, they were converging at several points. Investigators realized that certain names appeared repeatedly across multiple separate cases, not as suspects, but as signatories, overseers, or intermediaries. These seemingly minor roles multiplied the importance of the case because they showed that the crime was not rooted only at the level of action, but also at the level of decision-making. At the same time, some long-standing figures suddenly disappeared from view, unexpected trips, early retirements, or transfers to undefined positions, all signs that the concern was real. Yet simultaneously others chose to speak, not out of sudden courage, but because they realized silence was no longer safe. This shift mattered because for the first time the balance began to tilt. When silence becomes costly, truth gains value. New reports revealed indicators that had previously been ignored, connections between individuals, shared timelines, and decisions that at first glance seemed unrelated, now aligned to form a clearer picture, a picture that was not accidental, but constructed. At this stage, no one could credibly claim that everything was coincidence, because the patterns were clearer than ever, even if some refused to see them. In the public sphere, a growing sense of distrust also took hold, not in the form of shouting, but in quiet questions, lingering looks, and unfinished conversations. People slowly began to understand that this story was not only about the past, but about how the system functioned in the present, and that realization carried weight because it brought responsibility. At this point, the investigation was no longer merely about discovery, it had become a test of who was willing to pay the price of seeing and who preferred to look away. This confrontation, quiet yet real, was unfolding day by day, becoming increasingly clear, because when a case reaches this stage, it is no longer simply about evidence, it is about choice. That choice was difficult for many, but unavoidable, because the path had been opened and return was no longer possible. Along this path, every attempt to concealment bought only time, not forgetfulness, and time itself was no longer working in anyone's favor, because the truth was now in motion, not fast, but steady, and that steadiness was more dangerous than any sudden revelation, because it showed that something deep within was changing, and that change could no longer be contained. At the end of this phase, there was no announcement of results, no verdict, and no sense of calm. What remained was movement, a slow but constant movement toward a point where hiding would no longer be possible, because once something is seen this clearly, ignoring it becomes impossible. The case was now moving along this path, without noise but unstoppable, until everything surfaced, even if some were unprepared, because truth ultimately finds its own way, and that way was now opening, real, heavy, and inescapable. No one could claim ignorance anymore, because the signs were everywhere, gradually connecting to form an image that could not be denied, even if accepting it was difficult. Reality, once illuminated, does not fade, and the process had reached a point where nothing would ever be the same again, not in appearance, not in decisions, and not in collective memory, because what has been seen remains, and that permanence is the greatest change of all, a change that began quietly but left a mark that cannot be erased. When truth reveals itself, it does not retreat, and this story was now moving along that path toward clarity, even if the road was hard, even if it demanded a price, because in the end, reality does not stay hidden, and this truth was now in motion, persistent, calm, and relentless, until no one could say they did not know, because everything had become clear, real, heavy, inescapable.
As the truth drew closer to the surface, the investigation entered a phase where neither total concealment nor rapid exposure was possible. Everything hung in a state of suspension, a place where every move could carry irreversible consequences. At this stage, investigators listened more than they spoke, because they understood that what remained unsaid was sometimes more important than what was officially recorded. In interrogations, silence had gained meaning. Pauses, glances, and shifts in tone became signals that never appeared in reports, yet clearly pointed the way forward. Some individuals, when confronted with evidence, neither denied nor confessed, but instead tried to buy time through requests for delays, legal consultations, or the transfer of responsibility. This behavioral pattern revealed that fear of the consequences of truth could be as strong as fear of truth itself. At the same time, some long silent witnesses began to reappear, not with confidence, but with caution. They spoke of things that complicated the picture of the case, showing that parts of the story had never been documented at all. In several reports, contradictions emerged that now made sense. Names once pushed to the margins were moving to the center, while familiar figures slowly stepped aside. Within the inner workings of the case, a sense of anticipation had formed, not for closure, but for confrontation. Everyone knew a moment was coming when gestures and hints would no longer be enough. In this waiting period, time stretched but did not stand still. Each day revealed small details, a signature, an order, or a brief phone call. These small fragments gradually assembled into an image that could no longer be denied. Psychological pressure intensified on everyone involved, not only on suspects, but on investigators, witnesses, and even observers who believed themselves removed from the situation. When truth approaches, its circle of impact inevitably expands. The central question was no longer what had happened, but who was willing to face it and who still hoped to look away. The case now stood on the threshold of a phase where every choice carried weight and no decision was neutral. The movement continued, not with speed, but with pressure, and that pressure caused slips to appear, minor mistakes, unfinished sentences, or reactions that lingered too long. To investigators, these slips mattered because they showed that truth was beginning to impose itself. At the end of this phase, no announcement was made and no verdict delivered, yet something had changed. No one could any longer claim that time was working in their favor. The truth was now so close that even silence carried meaning, a meaning from which there was no escape. The case moved at this precise point on the edge of confrontation, in the narrow space between knowing and speaking, and everyone understood that this space could not last forever. When truth comes this close, one must either confront it or break under its weight. That choice now stood before everyone, heavy, serious, and inescapable. The truth was on the verge of speaking, not through shouting, but through presence, and that presence alone was enough to ensure that nothing would ever be the same again. The path continued, quiet,
compressed and unstoppable toward a moment when no one could claim ignorance. Everything stood on the verge of becoming clear, real, heavy, and unavoidable. The truth moved silently but persistently forward until no one could simply walk past it. When truth reaches this level of proximity, one must either stop and face it or step aside beneath its weight. That moment had arrived, a moment no longer open to delay, because reality stood on the brink of expression, even if no one was prepared. Truth does not wait, and when its time comes, it reveals itself, indifferent to the wishes of others. The case now stood at this exact point, on the edge of truth, in the middle of a choice, facing something that could no longer be ignored. Silence was no longer a refuge, and the story moved along this path, heavy, steady, and relentless, until truth no longer required an invitation, because it had already entered, real, inescapable, and fully present.
As the case entered the final stage of investigation, what had remained on the margins for years moved to the center, not as a sudden exposé, but as a slow pressure that could no longer be endured. At this point, no one could claim to have played no role because the evidence showed that silence, delay, and indifference were themselves forms of participation. Certain documents revealed that reports had been deliberately shortened, timelines altered, and responsibilities shifted toward individuals who were never held accountable. These findings made it clear that the system had not only preserved error, but actively sustained it. At the same time, related cases that had gone unresolved for years were re-examined, and the similarities could no longer be denied. Common patterns in time, place, and behavior emerged, patterns that clearly showed this case was not an exception, but an example of something far broader. At this stage, testimonies became more precise. Individuals who had remained silent until recently now understood that silence was no longer safe, and they began to speak in ways that changed the course of the case, not with emotion, but with details, timelines, names, and indicators. It was these details that pushed the case beyond doubt. In the public sphere, silence was no longer accepted as it once had been, not because of complete information, but because of the accumulation of signs. People sensed that something had been hidden for years and was now beginning to surface. At this stage, the debate was no longer only about guilt, but about accountability, about who must answer and who had been allowed for years to look away. The case had reached a point where no word was neutral. Every decision carried meaning, and every delay had consequences. Under this pressure, some faces changed, not out of remorse, but because reality had become unavoidable. The truth was no longer containable. At the end of this phase, neither an ending nor calm was declared, but a certainty emerged that some things would never return to how they were before. Not trust, not structures, and not narratives. The case stood at a point where either everything would be said or everything would collapse. At this moment, the weight of truth was fully felt, not as an abstract concept, but as something that could no longer be ignored. Everyone knew the movement continued, not with speed, but with certainty, and that certainty meant no one could credibly claim ignorance. The truth was fully visible, even if some refused to see it. There was no return from this path, because when truth reaches this stage, it must either be accepted or it will carry everything away with it. The case moved forward at this exact point, real, heavy, and inescapable, toward a moment when no one could escape its burden. The truth stood here not to frighten, but to remain, and that permanence changed the meaning of everything. When truth remains, life cannot continue as before. This was precisely where the story had arrived, quietly yet fully present, ready to alter everything forever, even if no one wished it to. Truth does not allow us to turn back. The case continued along this path until nothing would ever be the same again, not in law, not in memory, and not in narrative. The truth had now settled, real, heavy, and inescapable, and that reality had changed everything permanently, even if no one yet dared to say it aloud. Because when truth becomes this clear, it no longer needs words. The story now stood before something that could not be ignored, a truth present not as an allegation, but as reality itself, and that reality was no longer deniable. This was not the end, but the moment when everything began again, even if no one was ready, because truth does not wait, and when its time comes, it reveals itself. After the case reached a point where denial was no longer possible, a phase began that for many was more dangerous than the discovery of the truth itself, the phase of consequences. Because now it was not only the primary perpetrators, but everyone who had stood on the margins for years who was being pulled into the light. In this phase, some cases were quietly closed, not because of innocence, but due to lack of jurisdiction, the passage of time, or expediency. That very word, expediency, returned to the center of debate because it had become clear how, for years, crimes had been hidden behind it. In some regions, families emerged who had searched for their children for years and never received answers. Now, certain names were being linked to the reality of the case for the first time, not with certainty, but with possibilities that had been buried for years. At the same time, institutional responses were divided. Some promised reform, while others chose to manage the issue rather than resolve it. This small but decisive difference mattered because management meant controlling the truth, while resolution meant accepting it. In some official meetings, the discussion was no longer about what had happened, but about how much of it could be said. That limitation itself showed that the truth was still unbearable for some. On an individual level, consequences had begun as well. Some people lost their positions, some quietly stepped aside, and others returned with altered faces, not to be accountable, but to survive. In the public sphere, a dual emotion had taken shape: anger and exhaustion. For many, the question was why truth always arrives so late, and why its cost so often falls on the shoulders of the victims. These questions had no simple answers, but ignoring them was no longer possible. In this same phase, some documents were permanently classified, not because they were unimportant, but because they were dangerous to individuals, institutions, and official narratives. This classification was itself another sign that not everything would be said. Yet even these silences spoke, because when something is hidden, its meaning is no less significant than what is openly stated. The case now stood in a stage where there were no heroes and no clear ending. What remained was a heavy path that had to be walked to the end, even if no one was satisfied by it, because truth had not come to please, but to remain. At this stage, it had become clear that some names would never be spoken and some answers would never be given. But that very incompleteness was part of the truth, because it showed that justice is not always complete, yet it is still consequential. The case had reached a point where even unfinished outcomes carried meaning, because something had changed: perspectives, sensitivities, and red lines. This change was quiet but real, and its reality made it dangerous, because there was no returning to what had been before. The case now moved along this path, not toward calm, but toward awareness, and that awareness alone was enough to ensure that nothing would ever be the same again, not for the system, not for society, and not for the victims, because truth, even when unfinished, still has impact. That impact was now in motion, heavy, quiet, and irreversible, until no one could claim ignorance, because everything had been seen, even if not everything had been said. The story now stood at this point, between knowing and enduring, a place where history finds meaning, not to judge, but to remember that silence is never without cost. This case had now shown exactly that: real, heavy, and inescapable. The reminder remained, not as a story, but as a warning that could no longer be ignored, because the truth had done its work, even if full justice had not been seen. Seeing everything is not always possible, but knowing is enough. That knowledge was now in motion, silent, persistent, and lasting, until nothing would ever be the same again, not in law, not in society, and not in memory, because truth remains, even when incomplete, and that remaining is the greatest change of all, a change that began quietly but left its mark, a mark that can no longer be erased. The truth had now been seen, real, heavy, and inescapable, and that act of seeing changed everything.
With the case finalized, what had remained in the shadows for years finally reached a point where there was no escape. After months of hearings, testimony, and the examination of evidence, the court issued its final verdict. The husband of the Sullivan family was identified as the central architect of the child abduction and trafficking system, a man who for years had not only given orders but maintained control and oversight over every stage. He was sentenced to death, and the sentence was carried out in heavy silence, not with spectacle, not with relief, but with a bitterness that felt insufficient to many. There was no ceremony, no sense of closure that eased the pain,
only a judgment recorded in history for crimes whose scale went far beyond a single name. But the case did not end there. The woman of the family, who for years had presented herself as calm and unremarkable, was sentenced to a long term in prison. She never reached the end of that sentence. Several months after her transfer to prison, news of her suspicious death emerged. The official reports cited illness as the cause, yet no details were ever made public. No autopsy was released, no convincing explanation offered. That uncertainty became the final link in a chain that showed that even at the end, the full truth was never completely spoken. With the official closure of the case, parts of the network were never brought to trial. Some names remained permanently sealed within classified records, and certain paths were deliberately left unfinished. Even so, the impact of the case could not be denied. For the first time, specific federal laws against child trafficking were enacted. The system for caring for orphans was reformed, and public perception of what constituted a safe family fundamentally changed. Respectable appearances and silence were no longer guarantees of trust. The basement of the Sullivan farm was sealed forever, not merely as a physical place, but as a symbol that evil does not always arrive with shouting, but often grows quietly in silence. That basement was closed, but the voices of its victims were not. The names of many children were never recovered, and the fate of others remained unknown. Yet the case changed one crucial thing. It was no longer possible to say, "We didn't know." This story did not end with peace, nor with complete justice, but it ended with awareness, an awareness that endured, heavy and irreversible. The truth may have been spoken late, and perhaps incompletely, but it was spoken, and that was enough to force history to pause and look once more. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this video. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share your thoughts with us in the comments.